There are some facts about the signs of the different functions. So whether sine, cosine, and tangent and so on are positive or negative in the different quadrants. And this we can just figure out by knowing the signs of the x and the y. And the r is always positive. So what really makes the difference here is whether x is positive or negative and whether y is positive or negative. In the first quadrant, both the x and the y are positive, and the r is always positive. So that means that any of those ratios that we do for the trig functions, we're going to have all positive numbers. That means all 6 of our trig functions are positive in the first quadrant. So here it's all of them. In this quadrant, our x would have negative values. The y would still be positive. So what that's going to affect is the functions that involve the x. That would be cosine, which would turn out to be negative, and the tangent, which would turn out to be negative. The sine and the cosecant would still be positive. So in this quadrant, sine of theta and its reciprocal cosecant of theta are positive. In this quadrant, both the x and the y are negative. That would mean sine's negative, cosine's negative, and the reciprocals are negative. So the only ones left are tangent and cotangent. Tangent is y over x. That means we'd be dividing a negative by a negative, so we'd get a positive value. So in this quadrant, our tangent is positive, and its reciprocal cotangent is also positive. And finally, in the fourth quadrant, what's negative here is the y. Any functions that involve the y are going to be negative. That would be sine, cosecant, tangent, and cotangent. So the only ones that are positive here are cosine and secant. Now there are a lot of things to remember in this class, and this looks like a lot to remember right here. I like to give you memory tricks as much as possible, and there's a really good one for this. If we think about our 3 main trig functions, so if we think about sine theta, cosine theta, and tangent theta, if we just think about these 3 and don't worry about the other ones, if we look at what happens in the different quadrants, in this one, all of them are positive. In this one, sine is positive. In this one, tangent is positive. And in this one, cosine is positive. And there's a memory trick to remember how this works. It's all students take calculus. So if you can remember all students take calculus, it goes around in the same order as our quadrants do. So it goes 1, 2, 3, 4. And that tells you which of those 3 main trig functions is positive in that particular quadrant. So that makes an easy way to remember this. In this example, we're just trying to find the signs of the trig functions for each particular angle. So all we need to know here is what quadrant the angle is in. For 54 degrees, if we think about what the picture looks like, this is 0 degrees, this is 90 degrees. 54 is between those two. That means it's in quadrant 1. And remember, in quadrant 1, all of the trig functions are positive. So in this one, we could just say all 6 of them are positive. 260 degrees. If we think about our angles, 260 degrees is between 180 and 270. That puts it down here somewhere, which is in the 3rd quadrant. And if we do our memory trick, it was all students take. Take stands for tangent, so that means that tangent of 260 is positive, and cotangent of 260 is positive. All the rest are negative. And finally, if we have negative 60 degrees, so here's 0 degrees, here's negative 90 degrees, so negative 60 degrees would be somewhere in between those two. That means it's in quadrant 4. And if we do our memory trick again, it was all students take calculus. C stands for cosine, so that means the cosine of negative 60 is positive. Its reciprocal secant is also positive, and all the rest of them are negative. On this example, they tell us about the signs of a couple of the functions, and then we have to figure out what quadrant our angle could be in. So in this one, we know tangent of theta is greater than 0, so tangent is positive. Where that happens is in either quadrant 1 or in quadrant 3. I'm using that memory trick again. It's all students take. Take stands for tangent, so that's in quadrant 3. For cosecant, what we want to think about is that it's a reciprocal of sine. So if cosecant is less than 0, that means that sine of theta is also less than 0. And where this happens is in quadrant 3 or quadrant 4. So where both of these would be true, the only overlapping quadrant we have here is quadrant 3. Our angle theta would have to be in quadrant 3. For this one, we have sine is greater than 0, so where that happens is in quadrant 1, where they're all positive, or in quadrant 2. And secant, if we think about the reciprocal of secant, that's cosine. So if secant is negative, that means cosine's negative. That happens in quadrant 2 or quadrant 3. And we're looking for where these overlap so that both of these are true. That would be quadrant 2.